If you want to use PairDrive or any sort of hypercore stuff for a React Native app, it is possible theoretically, and it is pretty easy, but the tutorial stuff about it is pretty complicated, and it's kind of hard to understand because it's only built in the simplest way. If you're a new developer, or like the type of person that I built PairDrive for, which is someone that's not the most experienced, can't really figure out hypercore stuff because it's really complicated, but you know how to do basic things like WebSockets or creating apps. I basically just want to show you how you can run stuff in the Bare Runtime backend worklet, and you can get it connected to the global state in the front end of your app, because that's something that's not really gone over in any sort of tutorials. It's not really that hard. It just, if you're not the most experienced, it could be something where you're like, you don't even know where to begin, which is like the sort of problem that I've had a lot getting started with hypercores and things like that in Bare Runtime. So hopefully this will make it very easy for you. I basically took the autopass example and ripped out everything that we don't need. Some stuff to note, you do not want to use Expo Go. Expo Go does not work. You want to use Gradle. So if you don't have Gradle, you need to get it. I sort of got around that. I use Gradle by just having the build scripts be Expo Run instead of Expo Start. But if you run Expo, you run npm run start or whatever, and you see Expo Go anywhere, that's a bad thing. That it's not going to work. It might work at first, but it's not actually going to work when it comes time to connect the RPC from the Bare Runtime like little worklet and the front end. It's going to not work, and you're going to wonder why. Like I did. The answer is because it doesn't work with Expo Go. So you want to make sure that you're using Gradle. So if you see Expo Go pop up anywhere when you're starting up, it's not going to work. So this is the starting point. This is step 1. This is just the boilerplate. That's it for like starting up the app. This will be on the step-1 branch. So if you want to copy this, the link to the repository for this will be in the description. We're starting out, it'll be in the step 1 branch. So just go to the step 1 branch and you will get this boilerplate, which we are going to fill out and turn into a functional app. As you can see, the starting point right here is just a green screen that says autopass example. It's just the home screen. So if we go here, it's just this. It's just this. Like if I change that from a pair to hello, there we go. Yeah, so this is just the home screen. That's all that's here. If you'll see the structure that we basically have, we have the backend folder. That's where you're going to put everything in the backend. So this is going to be a little process that runs in the background. And this is where you put all the node stuff. The stuff that doesn't necessarily run on like the front end. You just run it on the back end where all the bare node packages are available to you, and it's basically like a little Node.js runtime that you get in the background. And then you create this little RPC for IPC, inter-process communication, which you handle with RPCs, remote procedure calls, which is basically, it's kind of like a little WebSocket that you run, and it creates a little pipe between this backend that's running in Node.js and the React Native, which is running in JavaScript. I mean, it's only compatible with JavaScript, so anything Node.js you want to run, you got to run in the backend. So we have this little backend file, then the pictures and whatever, and then the app. This is where all the React Native code goes, the app. We have the home screen, and then like, you know, the bucket of components, the little bridge between the RPC and the front end that we have to make. We're going to be using context API, so you could do this with Redux. There's no like specific reason why you can't, but this is just simpler with context API, and once you understand how it works, you'll be able to do it with Redux if you want to. I'm not the biggest fan of using Redux. I typically will default to context just because I'm not aware of any significant performance difference, and it's just simpler. Yeah, that's about it for step 1. Step 2, I think the best, most straightforward way to start out is just build the home screen into what we want. So we're just going to get rid of this. We're going to create a text. Yeah, sure. RPC example. We're going to create a text that's going to be the counter. We don't need to do any of the styles. Let's just do text. And then this is going to be... So we're just going to make a counter. We're going to put a little count variable in the back end. And that's just going to be a number. And then we're going to create buttons to increment and decrement that count. And so those commands will go from the front end through the RPC to the back end. And then the back end will change the count. And then every time the count changes on the back end will shoot the new value up to the front end. And as the back end changes value, it will automatically update the front end. So it won't be like after you make an input on the front end, it will tell the back end to give the new number. We're going to make it so every time the numbers or any data in the back end changes, it's automatically going to refresh on the front end, which is going to be necessary for hypercores because everything hypercores do is either you doing them or the hypercore is reacting to new information. So we want to make the RPC react to information it gets over a network, but we're not really going to be having a network right now. We're just going to be making simple number variable. And then you want the front end to react to any changes that happen on the back end. So that's really what we're going to be focusing on, having the front end react to changes on the back end, because once you know that, how to get that working in React Native, everything else about hypercores normally just applies the same basically. So that's what we're going to do. This is going to be the counter variable. We're just going to put 1. It's just going to be 1. And then we're going to put a button. And then we're going to create the on increment. And then the on decrement. So then we're going to wire up those. Oh, wait a minute. There's no children. Okay. I haven't, I've only done this once. I haven't used React Native in a while. So this is what we're going to do. We have the self-closing tag. This is the increment, and this is the decrement. And so that's pretty much all we need for the front end. We are going to fill these out with actual functions first, but in order to get these working, we actually need to connect to a state. So once we have that, we are going to go to create a state. Oh, we're also going to have to make some types here. That's right. Okay. You know what? We're going to make the types first. So we're going to go into types. So we're going to make export type counter state. So this is going to be the state of the context object, which is just going to be the count. And you might wonder why the RPC stuff is currently missing. It's because we are going to separate all the actual data we're watching from the RPC itself. And that's going to make sense as we go along, because we want the RPC to be its own thing that sits underneath all of the data that we actually need from the RPC. And then for the front end to actually alter the count, so from the back end, the counter is going to change, and then the back end is going to send that new value for the counter up to the front end, and then the front end is going to get that new counter variable, and through a separate process, it's going to change the front end version of the count. So it's always going to mirror the back end. So we need a counter action that's just set count. All we need is set count. And all it's going to do is take the value that it gets. The payload is going to be the value that it gets from the RPC. And then we're going to import. Yeah, so this is like the worst part of TypeScript is the types. I used to love TypeScript. I don't know what I was thinking. I feel like a lot of the problems with TypeScript are just like, it doesn't actually solve anything. So we take the counter state. It's just like, it's like you can create things intelligently and add doc strings, and then you get all of the good stuff that you get from TypeScript with none of the bad stuff. Like this. This is like illegible. So the context takes counter state and the dispatch, which is what changes it. Or undefined, because it starts out undefined. Which is like, that doesn't help anybody. Okay, so then we create the reducer, which is what, hey, I did it. The reducer is how we update it. How we handle updates. So all we have is set count. It's just going to take a number, and it's going to set count to that number. Because remember, we're only updating the count to mirror whatever it gets from the RPC. So with pretty much anything that you do with the RPC on the back end, if you're taking data from the back end, you're not going to want to have a bunch of reducer actions on anything that you're mirroring from the back end. You just want to be able to set it, and then it's going to set to whatever the RPC sets it to. You just want it to be like a mirror. That's all you want. So you're never going to have anything that's really more complicated than this when you're talking about data that exists on the back end. And then we need the provider. Oh, AI does it all. Okay, cool. Let me just make sure this is all accurate. It is conventional to make components capital, so we're just going to stick to that convention. Okay, yep, that's the counter context. And then we're going to wrap this up in a master provider component. So we're going to import the provider. Then we're going to export the... There we go. Okay, AI did it all. So basically we want to take all of the little context APIs, all of the provider components, and wrap them all up in a single provider, because we're making a global state here, which you could do with Redux, but it's in this context, it's simpler to do with context. So we're going to take everything, and when we get the RPC, the RPC is also going to go in here. So we're going to put everything all the little states that are going to mirror from the RPC. In this tutorial, it's just the counter, but in your app, as you get more complex with your app, it's going to be a whole bunch of things. And you're going to take the RPC and all those little data points that you're going to get from the RPC, and you're going to wrap them up in a master provider that you're going to put in the entry point of React Native. So no matter where you are, you can access the RPC, and you could also access all the data that you need from the RPC, and you don't even have to worry about re-rendering or anything, because it's all going to be handled within the context API. So we basically have all of that here, and we are going to hook this up to the entry point, which I believe is in app/index.js. It might be in layout. I don't remember. Yeah, I think we should put it in layout actually. So we're gonna import. Yeah, it's to do app provider. I added little tags because I don't remember every little detail of this. I did this a few months ago. I did it once, so I'm trying my best to remember and make a tutorial as smooth as possible for you. Okay, so the reason why we put this in layout is because that way, no matter what screen you're actually on, it will load. So if you put it in the main layout, every page that you make in React Native, if you use this boilerplate, if you use the starting point in step 1, everything will be either a tab in the layout or a tab inside of one of the tabs in this layout. But everything is going to be a child of this app/layout component. So if you put the app provider in here and you wrap it around, everything that's a child of this app provider is going to have access to the RPC and to all of the data that you set. So no matter what, you'll be able to use the RPC and the data everywhere, which is like kind of the whole point. We're trying to marry the front end and the back end here. So I just want to make sure that this sets, we have a default here. I'm going to make the default 341. There we go. And then we're going to make sure that in the home page, we're actually using this counter. So we need to import use counter. Oh, I didn't make that? What? Okay. I'm sorry, we gotta go back. This is a shit show. Okay. I'm not worried. So this is how we import the counter as a state variable. I swear I've used React before. The thing is, I started React in 2018, I believe, and so much has changed. Like, none of this stuff existed. Like, it's changed so many times. It's hard to keep up with all the changes. It's just, you just take the counter. Const counter. So we import the counter variable from that context using use counter, which is in that state/counter context. We created the functions for the buttons, but we're going to ignore those for now. You just want them in there, and you want the buttons in there. And then we have the counter variable here, which instead of 1, we're going to set that to the counter context. So we have the variable in there, which is count. So if you see in here, it sets the count. So we import the entire state, which is an object, and count is a key inside that object. That's why it's like that. So we have counter.count, which is taking the counter from the state, and then we have these useless functions. So if we run this and it's hooked up correctly, it should show the count to be 341. And that will be the end of step 2. And then step 3 is going to be actually setting up the backend to have the counter exist on the backend. We're going to set that number to white. Yeah, okay. 341, which is the number I set in the context. So everything is set up here. Okay, so now we're going to move on to step 3, which is going to be creating the basic backend. Okay, so on step 3, we're going to do setting up the basic backend. I also noticed that the text was very small, so I just made it a lot bigger, so hopefully that helps a lot. But it's not really that necessary. Every step is a new branch in the GitHub, so you could just follow along there. And it's not the biggest deal if you can't see it that well, but going forward, it's going to be a little bigger, so you could actually see it. So now we're going to set up the backend. The variable. So for this, we're making a number. If you're going to use pairdrive, the way pairdrive works is it'll be a little bit more complicated. The callback hooks inside of a pairdrive. So we could just say const pd equals new pairdrive, and then do all the code to set that up, set up the pairdrive, and then you do pd.on local and whatever, and just set up all the callback hooks, and then you basically tell the RPC to send whatever data. But that's just a little bit more complex version of the basic thing. So we're just doing the most basic thing here. We have a number. And now we have to basically set up the RPC and export it. No, okay, so we receive the IPC from the front end. We receive the inter-process communication from the front end, and then we set up the RPC to basically handle requests and responses that we're going to be sending from the front end, which is increment and decrement. So we're going to go into here. Just to keep these things in the same places, we have a separate file that's just called RPC commands. So we're going to do export const RPC increment, which is a command we're going to be sending from the front end, 0, and then decrement. So these are basically going to be connected to the 2 buttons on the front end, and the RPC here. So now we're going to create the RPC object, const RPC equals new RPC. So the RPC takes 2 arguments. The stream, the IPC, it takes the inter-process communication thing, which is just something we'll set up in a moment on step 4, and then whatever request it gets. You don't have to put all these logs. I like to put all these logs, especially if I'm trying something new, so I could see things happen as they happen, so I could understand the flow of the code. We're going to create a switch here. For some reason, some people never use switches. If I have a bunch of if-else, I tend to use switches. I don't know why. I learned it in college, and I just never let it go. So maybe that's not a good idea. So we got to import the commands. So we're going to handle increment and decrement. Oh, okay, yeah. Yeah, that's about right. The status, I don't know if that's really necessary. I think I'll just send out the counter. It might be, it'd probably be better if you're doing more complicated things to add a success flag. And then default. Default is just going to break. Yeah, I mean, that's probably good. You probably always want that at the bottom anyway. I mean, we're using constants here. That's kind of the whole point of having an RPC commands as separate constants that you import so that something like this will never run. But we might as well. Oh, also, we might want to add a get count. So if you restart the app, you could add a get count. So the app can just ask for the count. But the way that we're going to set it up is we're just going to send the count out. We'll add it for now. We're going to add the get count. It's not really necessary, but I suppose if you want to like save the count, like to a JSON file, and restart, you will want to be able to just get the count to start up. But this is basically all we need for the RPC. The RPC is basically just going to take commands from the front end. It's going to take the increment command, and it's going to change the count, and it's going to return the counter. That's all we're going to have the RPC do. There's not really anything else we need to add to the RPC. So step 4 is going to be setting up the RPC on the front end, which is going to involve two things. This RPC bridge, which you will see the reason for that in a minute. But then also the RPC is going to be an object on the front end. Just like it's set up as a variable in the back end, it's going to be a variable in the front end. And we're also going to put that variable in the context. Even though components, I would generally say, aren't going to be using the RPC directly, it's going to be an object that we want to hold in the global state. So here we're going to create the RPC, and it's going to be just like the counter, except instead of a number, we're going to be holding an RPC object. Oh yeah, we need to do the types. Yeah, that's okay. I was confused. I confused myself. You always have to remember when setting up context stuff, the default state for things that are asynchronously constructed is always going to be null. So that's just another quirk of TypeScript, even though realistically it's never going to be null as you're using it. As it builds, it's going to be null. So we have a ready state that's basically to let us know if the RPC is actually ready. That helps us for like, you know, anything with asynchronous code. You don't want things to run before they're ready. So if you are ever in a situation where you call it and the RPC isn't actually active, instead of, you know, causing your app to crash, you could just say, hey, it's not ready yet. And then we actually want to load the RPC into state. So that's going to be a function. That's the type we need. So then we go back to the RPC. And then set RPC is just going to be a blank function. And then we create the provider, which is just a React component. And then that React component has the states here, because there's going to be two different values inside this state. Besides the function, we're going to have RPC, set RPC, and set ready. You'll see why we have the set RPC as another value in the state. For every single state, we want to have a use. And then because we have that, the set RPC as another variable, which we are going to need because we're going to have another component actually run through the RPC commands and stuff. The bridge, the RPC bridge, we're going to have to send out the set RPC as a value, so we need that use RPC dispatch, unlike the counter. And so that's the RPC object. And then we're going to create the bridge. I think that's probably enough for step 4. Yeah, because the RPC is going to be altering everything around here, so it's probably just a good idea to have the RPC the innermost, and then all of the data that comes out of the RPC to be a parent component. So now we actually need to connect the RPC and the back. we need to create the RPC, which is the IPC between the front end and the back end. So that's probably enough for step 4. Okay, so now for step 5, we're going to actually connect the front end and the back end. We're going to create the RPC for the front end and the back end. So there's IPC, or the inter-process communication. I hate all the acronyms. I remember when I was kind of new, the acronyms really threw me off a lot. Where do I put that? That goes in components, the bridge component. So this bridge component is basically going to take everything from the state. So remember how I was talking about earlier? We set it up so that we put the app provider as a parent component of everything. And then we're going to put the RPC bridge right here. So that way, the RPC provider is a parent component of the RPC bridge component. So the RPC bridge component has access to the RPC, and it also has access to all of the data that we're going to pull from the RPC. So the RPC bridge is just meant to handle connecting whatever you get from the RPC and the data that you're going to load into the front end from the back end. This is what we're going to set up. This one's a little more complicated. I'm more or less going to be copy pasting, but I'm just going to type it here. We're going to be using use effects because as we pull in new data from the RPC, we're going to want to pull it. We're going to want to update it automatically. So we're going to need the worklet, which is like the little process. This is like the little process. This is the IPC, the worklet. This is just for turning buffers to strings and stuff like that. And then we need to import the... So the way it works is you build the bundle. So you build from the backend. You build this. There's a build backend command in the package JSON. This is what you use to build the front end bundle, which you see right here. And that's what we use to actually create the connection. So we import bundle. Okay, I restarted the recording because it was lagging. So we need to import this from... Actually set the RPC here. This is the component where we actually load the RPC. So now we're going to create the RPC bridge. We need to import, okay, RPC bridge. We don't actually need the count value here. We just need the dispatch. That's right. Okay, and then we actually need a function to actually set up the RPC. So if you remember, we set up the RPC where it could be an RPC or it could be null. That's because it starts out null and we actually need to load it in. So we're gonna have a function for that. And because we create this in its own component, we don't have to ever worry about it inside of the app. So we separate the actual connection between the front end and the back end from the rest of the app so that everywhere you are, you basically have the RPC already set up. So you need to create the worklet. And then the worklet runs the bundle. And this is one of those things where, in this type of thing, you really can't trust AI. So... Okay, so we create the worklet. We actually start the worklet on the backend code, and then we take the IPC, the inter-process communication from the worklet. And then we create the front-end RPC. And if you'll notice here, it looks a lot like the way we set it up on the backend, and that's because it's symmetrical. RPC update. Whoops. Okay, so there's another command. So that's just to receive any update from the backend. I'm not sure if we're going to be using that. I might go back and fix that. But here we're setting up the front end to the back end, back end to the front end. So this one catches all of the commands from the back end which I don't think we're using this one. Actually, yeah, we're not using this one. So, wait, are we? I'm sorry. I'm confusing myself here. Let's just put this in for now. I don't remember if we use this one or not. We're just gonna add some error handling here. I don't trust myself. So we're gonna set up this object, and then once this is set up to actually handle any requests from the backend, we're gonna set the RPC. Okay, I just remembered. So the way we're setting it up here in this code base is that anytime you increment or decrement from the front end will wait for the response. So all the commands are going from the front end to the back end. And when the back end gets those commands, when it finishes those commands, it returns the new value of the counter. So we don't actually need this. This is not how we're going to be working with it. So then we're just still going to leave this here because this is the pattern that you'd want if you start adding commands that get sent from the backend, which you will be doing. If you're using hypercores, you're going to be having things update from peers, and then the RPC will be on the backend. The worklet will be like, okay, I have this new stuff from hypercore. It's just going to sit here. And you'll want it to work such that it will know that it has to send that new data to the front end. So it'll be a backend command sent to the front end. And that's where we handle those things here on the front end. So let's say you have, you're making a messenger app, right? And you receive a message in a hyperswarm from a peer. That isn't reacting to something you did on the front end. That would be reacting to something a peer did. So then you'd want to create a command that the backend sends that says, hey, we got a new message from a peer. And this is where you set that up. This is where you set up the front end to respond to random things it gets from the backend. So we're not actually doing that with this counter because we're only updating the counter with responses from the front end. That's why we only need the default here. I'm still going to leave the switch though. And then we want to set the RPC object here, so that way in any child components, we can ask for the RPC and get it. We have all this stuff. And then we basically want to create a use effect with an empty dependency array. So with use effects, you have a function here, and then as the first argument, and then you have an array. This is the dependency array. Basically the way use effects work is every time a value inside of this array changes, the use effect will run. So the use effect will is a function that reacts to any changes to any of the variables inside of here. If you only want something to run, when it first mounts, you put an empty dependency array. If I just say start bridge here, this code will run every time this component re-renders. And this component will re-render every time any variable changes, basically. So you don't ever want to make random functions run outside. If you only want a function to run a single time when you start up the app, when the app is first loading, or when this component's first loading, you have to put it inside a use effect with an empty dependency array. Just in case you didn't know that. I'm making this for noobs, so I'm assuming you're a noob. That's why that works. Now we have the bridge, and whenever the bridge first mounts, it's going to run the start bridge, and the start bridge is going to be the thing that starts the backend worklet and sets up the RPC to react to commands that come from the backend. But we're not actually sending any commands from the backend. We're only reacting to commands, to responses from commands that are sent from the front end. So I'm gonna leave the switch here just because you'll generally want to use a switch. So now we need to load this into the app. So we're going to be loading this into the layout component, I believe. Yes, right here. So we're going to throw this RPC bridge in. So now we have the master component. The very first component that renders is the thing that holds the RPC and all of the data that you want from the RPC. So no matter where you go inside of the app, that data you'll have access to it. And then the very first component we load is the RPC bridge, which will load the RPC into the app provider And so basically that gives you an environment where any pages that you add that the user will use, they'll all be inside of here. So no matter what, everywhere in your app, you'll have access to the RPC and you'll have access to all the data that you are syncing from the backend to the front end. So that's the entire point of this setup. So now on the step 6 is going to be setting up the counter to actually send commands to the backend. I also realized I made a slight error. So something about the RPCs is I believe they handle like strings and buffers. So we have to go into the backend and update this. So it sends, okay. So here's what I messed up. We aren't returning a value. We are going to send a command that just sends the new state. So we actually also need RPC update here, which is fine. If you're following the tutorial, this hasn't actually resulted in anything that would cause you meaningful confusion. So we need to create a new request that comes from the backend, RPC update, and then we're going to do response. Whoops. So we create the response, and then we do response.send a stringified version of the counter. Okay, so that's the actual backend setup. So we're not actually going to be awaiting any RPC requests and updating with that, which is for the best, honestly, because this is like two-way communication. So we have the request coming in from the front end, we update the state, and then we send a new request from the back end to the front end. So you're seeing the two-way communication here. The RPC communication is symmetrical, which means that the way that you communicate from the front end to the back end is the same as the back end to the front end. Now that we set this up properly, so that we're sending RPC update requests from the back end, we need to go back in the bridge. Yep, here. So we're going to do case commands dot RPC update. So any RPC requests that you send from the back end, the only way to handle them properly is to set up a case for them in the switch in the front end RPC. So now we're going to use dispatch, which is what we imported from the counter. So dispatch is just setting the counter state. The counter state takes a number. We were trying to send in a string. So basically, the front end RPC is going to take any response with the RPC update command from the back end and is going to use it to update the count. So we basically have the pattern here. We have the connection between the front end and the back end. We have the back end and we have the front end. So now all we have to do is run. And the way it should work now is we'll see 341 as the first state. And then if we press plus, it will increment. And then if we press minus, it will decrement. So we see this is probably really small. Can I make this bigger? I can. Awesome. So you should be able to see that now. Okay, so here we have the app. 341, the starting state. Oh, what the fuck? I'm sorry. There's another thing I completely forgot. We actually need to build the backend. So it's not taking the backend straight from this backend folder. It's something that we need to build. Whoops, and there was a bug in it. Okay. So we build the backend, and then we start the code base. And then if all goes well, and it's not working. So let's figure out why it's not working. Oh wait, we didn't actually add the functions. Okay, I'm sorry about that. So we go to the home page. We didn't actually add these functions in. So here what we're going to do, we're going to import the useRPC. And remember, we don't actually need to import anything to update the counter directly. We have the RPC bridge automatically taking in anything from the backend and updating the state. We want to make sure if we try to do anything before the RPC loads, we just want to return. And then if it does work, like if the RPC is there, we are going to send the, whoops, RPC. So this needs some kind of data. Right now we're just like, if it gets the command to increment, then we're going to increment. You could make it so that you could have RPC change and then send the number and then do send 1 or -1. You could do that, but we're doing this RPC increment decrement. So we're going to add these functions. Okay. So now that we actually have the buttons wired up to send RPC requests to the backend, when we run the app, we should see everything work. Fingers crossed. Everything should work fine now. I made myself kind of big. I just noticed that. Make myself tiny. Tiny me. Oh no, I'm shrinking. Okay. So now it's set up. We see the starting number. So the 341 was the default we set on the front end, but the default we set on the back end was 0. So as we increment and decrement, it reset to just do whatever the backend counter value was. So that's why you see it jump from 341 to 1 the first time I press increment. So if you recall, we only set this up to send an RPC request on the front end. So increment just sends an RPC request, and everything else happens on the back end. So we press increment, right? We press increment. So this takes the RPC. This function on increment takes the RPC and sends the RPC increment request. That goes to the backend, and the backend says, okay, what does RPC increment do? It increments this counter, which initializes at 0, and then it sends an RPC update request back to the front end. And then if you see on the front end version of the RPC, what it does is it takes that RPC update and it sets the count to whatever it was. So the front end defaults to 341. And then once we update the count, it sets to whatever the backend had, which is 0. You can also make it so that the very first thing the RPC does is set itself to, set the front end to the value. So you can have it start out being whatever the backend has if you want. Anyway, that is basically how you set up connection between the front end and the back end, and you set up the values to the global state. I hope this was helpful. Yeah, let me know if you have any questions. This is the first time I tried to make a tutorial. I'm going to try to make more tutorials, especially when ParaDrive comes out. I'm going to be making ParaDrive specific tutorials, but I know some people had trouble with this specific thing, so I just wanted to help out with that. Okay, see ya.